what's going on with masculinity today?
Masculinity is in a critical point, I think, in our culture today. Is we're in this confusing sort of time where we have an up-and-coming generation that really hasn't been exposed to what we would call a traditional masculine model, and so there's a lot of confusion around that. And of course, the gender blurring culture that we live in right now complicates it even more, to where you can look at the testimony of a Supreme Court candidate who can't tell you what a woman is, and you got to wonder whether a 7 or 8 year old boy can tell us what a man is,
Mm-hmm.
and that kind of typifies really some of the stuff going on in today's culture. Even to use the word masculinity, it summons the word toxic, because that's just how we're used to hearing that heard. And that's a relatively recent thing, that masculinity was seen as something that's negative. So a lot of confusion around it today, Benjamin. I don't know how young men and boys are really navigating those confusing waters today.
You mentioned traditional masculinity and toxic masculinity. What does toxic masculinity, or not, what does non-toxic masculinity and traditional masculinity look like?
Yeah, well, my favorite definition, and one of the goals or philosophies or tenets of Trail Life USA, is a biblical masculinity, which takes a look at the model of Jesus as the man to look to for what masculinity looks like. And he had both a tender side and then also a strong side, and he showed that. And his respect for all people, there's respect for both men and women, for young, for old, his willingness to call out sin or something that he didn't agree with, his boldness to stand for what he understood to be truth, and he was truth, the capital T. So that's sort of the model for a biblical masculinity. And I think that this contemporary model of masculinity that kind of makes it feel somewhat out of touch. But when we look at the life of Jesus and who he was, and the example that he gave, he was anything but out of touch. I mean, he was totally aware of everything going on around him and in him and in others. And I think that that's the model of masculinity that we should really be shooting for.
So like having the courage to speak the truth even when it's adversarial, even when people don't like it, and to be respected by those around you. Is that a good summary of what masculinity means?
Yeah, although I would say that the respect is something that it's a byproduct, I think, of someone who knows who they are and stands firm on that knowledge, that awareness of who it is that they are, and has some sort of model for truth. For us, it's the Bible, the Word of God, that gives me confidence to stand on something. But at the same time, the vulnerability or the understanding that we're going to get it wrong sometimes, and the ability to turn back around and make things right when we get them wrong. And I think that that's the piece that's missing from what the description that we have of like a toxic masculinity. There's a man who can't admit or refuses to admit that he's wrong. We have the benefit of both having Christ as our model, but then also the recognition that we're not perfect like he was. And so we have to incorporate into that model the willingness to say, hey, dude, I really missed it. I got that wrong. And I think that brings even a more relatable sort of masculinity that I think the world is just really desperate for. And because it's so missing. It's hard to think about a generation that would storm the beaches of Normandy to free the world of tyranny without picketing in the streets or setting something on fire because they didn't want to. there's really something lost in that sort of generation of men that would stand for something. But they also weren't perfect. At the same time, they weren't perfect. They were still men. So they embraced this sort of masculinity side of the model. But you also have to carry with it the piece that says, I can get this wrong too. And I think that's really what we're shooting for is an awareness of the model that Christ gave us, but also the willingness to say, we don't always get it right.
Yeah, it seems to me that a lot of modern masculinity, at least what people want to strive to be toward, is this sort of Andrew Tate-esque person where it's all about going to the gym, driving fast cars, having lots of sex, and not really, there's no kind of morality behind it. They're very instrumental as opposed to inherent qualities.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess going off of that, what do you think being a good man means?
Yeah, well, you bring up a really good point in that any time that we kind of lose our way around some of these issues as a culture, there's always the opposite end that pulls us that way. So you're going to have your Andrew Tates and stuff. So I really believe that truth is somewhat held in tension. You have this one side that says men are, we had we've had movements in our culture that said men are no longer needed. They're not necessary, and we trained generations of young girls that you don't need a man, you don't want a man. And that somewhat was one side of that tension there. And then on the other side is they said, this is what a man is, the fast cars and all that kind of stuff. So somewhere in there, those things, truth is somewhat held in tension between those 2 points. And it takes that sort of a movement, almost an overemphasis on that sort of masculinity to kind of pull us back towards where the truth is, which is somewhere in the middle. So I think that's really interesting that you bring that up, because as much as culture is pulling a certain way, we do have other movements in their culture that pull drastically in another way. And I think that's sometimes important. It gives us a space to have a discussion and to find, where we are to be. And that's why I just always come back to Christ, because he never moves. He's at the same point on that continuum, or that stretch between those two places. He's at the center of truth, and that's really what we have to keep our eyes on that center of truth. So to some extent, we have to reject a little bit from both extremes in order to find our way to where God is really, really calling us to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That a lot of we need to be grounded in something that is eternal, something that is foundational, and not of an ever-changing culture, an ever-changing society whose standards will shift, constantly moving the goalpost around for what it means to be a man, to be a woman.
Yeah, and that's what's critical about having those sort of foundational truths where we agree that there's such thing as right and wrong. You can't even use those words today without implying that there is a standard somewhere. There's an absolute. And for us, it's the Word of God. 58% of Americans no longer believe that God or the Bible is a source of moral authority, and that's a challenge. That's what causes this kind of confusion, because if you're raising young boys, young girls even, and you want to talk to them about the concept of what is right or wrong and what is good or evil, and you don't have a foundation for those things, that isn't helpful at all. And that's why there's so much adrift in our society. So that's why the mission of Trail Life is to really recognize that there are absolute truths and found in the Word of God and in the person of Jesus that says, okay, this is where we set our plumb line. This is what we follow after, and all things are measured by that.
What have you learned about manhood from having led Trail Life for all these years and having raised two sons of your own?
Yeah, well, I have actually gained so much. I don't know, what is it? Not confidence. I'm being every day almost more and more reassured that God is at work in a remnant of men in our culture, at a minimum, a remnant of men in our culture who get this. Um, they're not the social justice warriors. You're not going to find them blasting people, on social media. You're going to find them quietly going about their lives and living out these truths. And these are the men we've had over 100,000 of them now come through Trail Life. These are the men that I can meet in Trail Life. They're men who are drawn to something that is true, something that is valid. They're drawn to a brotherhood. They're drawn to something bigger than they are. They're drawn to something that has purpose. They're drawn to something that helps them scale their identity. And so that's an amazing group, man. I say it all the time. Trailmen, that's what we call guys in Trail Life. Trailmen are the best men I know. And so it's been an amazing experience because I don't think I would have had that perspective without being so immersed in this culture of men who care enough to go out and sleep on the ground, in order to help raise the next generation or give up a weekend when they could be, sitting on the sofa watching sports or whatever, to go outside and hike a trail or something in order to pour into the next generation. And then they also find in that place their brothers. So it's not just the next generation, it's the men that they walk alongside with. And to see men come alive, the glory of God, I forget who said this, the glory of God is a man fully alive. And I think that that's what we're discovering is these men fully alive, finding, when you're talking about my sons, I remember coming home from a camping trip and my wife met me and Luke and Logan, who at the door, and she said, when you come home from these things, you're smelly, but you're taller. Yeah, that's significant. And I think a weekend away with the guys in the outdoors strengthens a man's spine. It reminds him of who he is. There's so many things in our culture, Benjamin, that are shaming men for being too strong or not strong enough, or too aware or not aware enough, too woke or not woke enough. There, you can't. A man in our culture today is pretty much shamed everywhere he goes. And the experience of Trail Life and organizations like Trail Life is that men are reminded of who they are. They see it in each other. And when they can see it in another man, they can begin to see it in themselves. And so I've learned that I'm encouraged by what I see. And I've learned that an organization like Trail Life, we're not just building an ark to protect boys from an evil generation, but we're also building a battleship to help them stand against this generation in the confusion behind it, not in a way that's destructive, but in a way that's an example of how to be a man who's fully alive. And that's what I'm experiencing in Trail Life. That's what it's shown me, is that there are men out there who are leaning towards wanting to find their purpose, their identity, where they fit, a band of brothers, something bigger than they are, a mission, all those things. And they're finding that in Trail Life. And I get to see these men who either come to us fully alive or they become fully alive through the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Trail Life definitely, because I went through it. Actually, I went all the way through the program from Woodland through the Freedom Award, and you really, you see the friends around you go from immature boys turning into mature men. Dennis Prager had a great quote that says, "All men should strive to become father figures."
Mm.
And I think it really resonated with me because I see a lot of guys who are not great role models. I look around and I go, yeah, this, I don't, I tend to say more, I don't want these qualities than I do. Like, I don't
Mm.
want that guy's gambling problem. I don't want that guy's drinking problem. And then you go to trail life and you see guys there who are great standards of men who build you up and who keep you growing as a person and as a man. One of our troop chaplain told me, was teaching me about leadership, and I tend to be the sort of person who gets up and does things, and I like to be in the weeds of it. And he told me that part of being a leader is to take a step back, and you're not so much being in doing things with the boys washing the dishes. You are showing them what to do, and then you're being an example of the person they should be like.
Mm.
You are making sure that everyone's being safe, and you're being the example to them about how to lead and how to become better men. And it just, it really struck me, and I think I've applied that today, and I've seen it, and it was just a great experience. Do you have any stories of seeing boys in trail life go from children to
Goodness.
men?
Yeah, so many. And you're right about the environment that's created in something like a train. 1 in 4 boys now doesn't have a father in his household, and 76% of public school teachers are female. And so girls have these wonderful examples. A girl being raised by a single mom, she's got an example of what a strong woman looks like. And a boy in that same house is like, I got nothing. And then he goes to school, and there's a teacher at the front of the classroom who's a woman. And then he goes to Sunday school, and 80-something% of Sunday school teachers are women. So everywhere this boy goes, he sees women who are strong and in charge, and he's really missing an example of what it looks like for a man to lead and to lead well. And so Trail Life provides that example. And you're right. Boys are hungry for that. They latch onto that. I love Dennis Prager quote. I like to say that I believe that any legitimate call to manhood must include a call to be a dad to natural sons, or a dad like to boys who don't have a dad, because that is such a critical thing for that boy to have that example of what a dad looks like. And I think about a boy out in California. You'll appreciate this. He got the Horizon Award, and he stood before his troop. Single mom, didn't have a dad, only he and his mom in the household, and stood before the troop to receive this award. And he said, "I need to thank the men in this room." He said, "You taught me how to shave, and you taught me how to love Jesus." And I thought, man, those guys, they nailed it. Those guys nailed it. And if you can imagine being that boy's mom who would cry out to God for men to help her raise her son, that he found in this community men who taught him both the practical things, just how to shave. What is she going to teach him how to shave? And how to love Jesus. He saw a man loving Jesus. And that's powerful stuff. And that, you can't get that. You're not going to get that on YouTube. You raise godly men in the company of godly men, and so it is important. And that's, I love what you quoted Dennis Prager, because I just believe the same thing. I think that we've got to take that on. I'm doing a trip, Benjamin. I appreciate this, in April. Over the course of my life, and I'm old now. I'm 65. I can't believe how old I am. But over the course of my life, my wife and I started in youth ministry early on, and we also did foster care and things like that. So we've always had young men around. Even when we did foster care, way before Trail Life, we did teenage boys. That's what we had in our home, because nobody else was taking teenage boys in the home. So we've always worked with boys and always worked with young people. And we're youth pastors and college pastors, and Michelle, my wife ran a crisis pregnancy center, so she's ministered to a lot of young women. So our whole lives, we've uh, taken on that role of helping young people to see what's next or to help walk them through difficult times. Not incredibly intentional. It just felt like that's what we were supposed to be doing. And so along the way, through this 40-something years of me mentoring young men, I've collected this group of men. And in my mind, they all know each other, because I think, because in my mind, they're like 15 to 20 years old, but they're not. They're like 30 to 45. And then some of them lived in different states, never met each other. In my mind, these are these guys. And so I'm doing a kayaking canoe trip next April with guys that are strung across my last 40 years of ministering to men one-on-one, and my two sons. And we're going out for 4 or 5 days on a paddle trip. And, C.S. Lewis, I wish I could quote this, but he basically says, there is something that only a third friend can do for two friends. So in other words, you and I are friends. But if we brought another person into this equation who is a friend of yours, I would see something different about you that I would never be able to see without that person being present. They would draw out of you something that I've never seen because our dynamic is different than the dynamic you have with them. And so I wish I could quote it because he says a lot better than I do. So I'm looking forward to bringing these guys together. A lot of them have never met each other, but we all have this connection. And my sense is that, I just love these guys so much one-on-one. And I know I'm going to leave this place. I know everybody, I had the privilege of meeting Dr. Dobson on a number of occasions. He just passed. I think about his legacy. Everybody leaves this place. My mentor right now is Dr. Dennis Rainey, amazing man to have as a mentor. And he's going to leave this place. I'm going to leave this place too. And I like leaving this place with the understanding that these guys know each other. And so I want to bring them together on this trip because I think there's something powerful about them sharing, not me, but there is some sort of connection in that to some degree they're able to say, hey, Mark knows this guy. He's okay, and that there's some sort of an instant connection between these guys. So I'm looking forward to that. Almost like I'm not setting it up as a laboratory, but I love the idea of seeing what happens in that space of guys who have been mentored in a similar way over a number of years, but have never met each other. Kind of looking forward to that. So, and a lot of these guys didn't have dads in their lives, or at least their dads weren't connected in a way that was either helpful or really strong. Some their fathers had passed, some they came from broken homes, some from other countries. So the young men from Africa, from the Caribbean, from all over the world on this paddle trip with me. And so I'm interested in seeing that, but the value they would all speak to, the value of having someone who said, I've been there before you. I've got some things that I think that I can offer. And what Prager is saying is that, that's so important. I think you and I agree to that too. If you don't have natural sons, you've got to find young men to pour into because they're so desperate for that kind of leadership. I took you on a really long trail there to answer that question, but that came to mind. I thought you'd find that interesting.
Yeah, that's a good. I think it reminds me of, was it? I want to say it was James Clear who said this. It might have been someone else, but you are the sum total of the 5 people you spend the most amount of time with.
Oh, that makes
And
sense.
in a lot of ways, you can know a person better by meeting the people they spend the most time with, because that'll tell you a lot about what things they like doing. What usually you're not with people who you don't enjoy, and so it's the people you enjoy being with. Are they people who are honest? Are they people who make you a better person? And yeah, and I think trail life provides a lot of that. And there's still some guys today that I'm hanging out with, and I just did a 18K with, or no, sorry, a 30K at 18 miles with one of them, and it was just a great time. And it really provides that, and
It's
it's
awesome.
great. All right,
Yeah.
so final question:
Yeah.
what is something that women should understand about men that they don't?
Wow. Um, I'm not a woman. Um, so I can only answer that to say, what would I want to know? Because I can say, I don't want to say what do I wish they knew, because they may already know it. I don't know. Um, what would I want to be reassured that women knew about men? I think probably, well, this is me personally. I can't even speak for all men. How important it is uh, for me to sense that my wife believes in me, and not only does that put some responsibility on me, because you don't want to let them down, but it also sort of awakens something on the inside of me. It says, I can do that. I'm capable. When we look at the fivefold mandate from Genesis: be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, have dominion. Those are in us. It's in our DNA, and to have that affirmed by specifically a wife, woman, is real. There's a lot that happens in that space to have that called out. A lot, your responsibility rises, your maturity level rises, your sense of value and importance in the critical role that you play all rises when somebody really believes in you. And to have a woman, have your woman believe in you is huge.
Thank you, and thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for coming on.